History breathes again, and forgotten voices rise from the ashes of time. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from, your city, your country, and the time as you listen. And if you have not yet subscribed and liked our channel, please take a moment to do so. Because tonight, we step into colonial New York in the year 1712, into a night of fire, fear, and resistance that shook a growing colony to its core. In the early 18th century, New York was not yet the towering city we know today, but a colonial settlement filled with narrow streets, wooden houses, trading docks, and deep inequality woven into daily life. Enslaved Africans were a significant part of the population, making up nearly 1/5 of the colony. They built roads, worked in households, labored at docks, and served merchants whose wealth grew from Atlantic trade. Slavery in New York was harsh and tightly controlled. Curfews were enforced. Movement was restricted. Gatherings were watched closely. The colony feared rebellion because enslaved Africans outnumbered white colonists in certain areas. Rumors of uprisings in the Caribbean and the South traveled through ports and taverns. Fear lived quietly beneath the surface of the settlement, and fear often breeds cruelty. Laws were written to restrict the movements of enslaved people. Punishments were severe. Whippings were common. Public humiliation was used as warning. The colony believed strict discipline would prevent revolt. But discipline built on fear can also plant seeds of desperation. Life for enslaved Africans in 1712, New York was filled with hardship. Families were separated by sale. Work hours were long. Food was limited. Winter brought cold that bit through thin clothing. Many enslaved Africans in New York came from regions in West Africa where they had known community, culture, and freedom before capture. The memory of that freedom did not disappear when chains were placed upon them. It lived quietly in stories shared at night, in songs whispered in secret, in glances exchanged between workers who understood one another without words. In taverns and kitchens and fields, enslaved men and women moved under watchful eyes. But watchfulness does not erase thought. It does not silence anger. It does not extinguish hope. And in the spring of 1712, that hope began to take a dangerous shape. Historians believe that a small group of enslaved Africans began to meet in secret. We do not know every name. We do not know every detail of their planning. Colonial records tell us only what authorities discovered afterward. But what we do know is this: they were determined to strike back. They were determined to make a statement in a colony that treated them as property. They chose a plan that relied on surprise and confusion. They would set fire to a building. When white colonists rushed to extinguish the flames, they would ambush them in the darkness. It was bold. It was risky. It was born from frustration and from a desire to disrupt the system that bound them. On the night of April in 1712, flames rose against the dark sky of New York. A building near what is now Broadway was set on fire. The alarm spread quickly. Colonists grabbed buckets and ran toward the blaze. Fire in a wooden settlement was deadly serious. It could consume entire blocks. As white colonists gathered near the flames, believing they were responding to accident or misfortune, they walked directly into the trap. From the shadows emerged armed enslaved Africans, carrying guns, knives, swords, and tools turned into weapons. Shots rang out. Blades flashed. Panic exploded in the night. The attack was swift and shocking. By the time the smoke cleared, several white colonists lay dead or dying. The colony had been struck at its heart. What had once been whispered fear had become violent reality. For the enslaved men who carried out the ambush, this was a moment of defiance in a world that denied them dignity. But they knew the retaliation would be brutal. Colonial power does not respond softly when challenged. Soldiers and militia mobilized quickly. The attackers did not escape far. Some were captured within days. Others took their own lives rather than face what they knew awaited them. The colony was furious. Fear turned into rage. Trials began almost immediately. The accused were brought before colonial courts, where evidence was thin and suspicion was heavy. Torture was reportedly used to extract confessions. The authorities wanted names. They wanted to ensure no larger conspiracy threatened their control. 4 enslaved Africans were burned alive. Others were hanged. Some were broken on the wheel. The executions were public and designed to terrify. The colony wanted to send a message that rebellion would be crushed without mercy. Laws were tightened further. Restrictions increased. Movement was limited even more severely. Fear returned to the streets, but now it carried the memory of fire. The 1712 revolt did not free the enslaved population. It did not topple colonial rule, but it did shake New York deeply. It revealed that beneath forced obedience lived resistance. It showed that even under heavy surveillance, people found ways to organize. It forced colonists to confront the reality that those they enslaved were not passive. They were human beings capable of coordinated action. And in that realization, the colony's sense of security was forever altered. The night of fire became a warning passed down through generations of slaveholders. It became a symbol of what they feared most: unity among the enslaved. For the men who participated, history remembers them mostly through court records written by their oppressors. Their voices are not preserved in diaries or letters. Their motivations are reconstructed from fragments. But their act remains one of the earliest organized slave revolts in Northern America. It stands as proof that resistance was not confined to plantations of the South. It existed in the heart of colonial cities. And as we move forward in this story, we will uncover how the revolt reshaped laws, intensified racial control, and planted seeds of fear that would influence New York for decades to come. The night after the fire burned in colonial New York did not end when the flames were put out. It only changed shape, because the smoke that drifted above the wooden rooftops carried more than ash. It carried fear, and fear moved quickly through a colony built on control. By morning, in April of 1712, the streets were filled with whispers and shock, and every white colonist understood that something had shifted. The bodies of the dead had been carried away, yet their absence felt heavier than their presence had. Merchants stood outside their shops, speaking in urgent low tones. Soldiers walked more firmly, with muskets in hand. Church bells rang, not for celebration, but for warning. The fire had been small in size, yet enormous in meaning. It was not the building that frightened the colony most. It was the realization that enslaved Africans had organized, waited, and struck deliberately. That knowledge shook the foundation of colonial confidence. For years, the colony had relied on strict laws and harsh discipline to keep order. Curfews were enforced, travel was restricted, enslaved people were not permitted to gather freely at night. The white population believed these measures were enough. But the revolt proved that obedience forced by fear can hide anger rather than erase it. And now that anger had exploded in gunfire and steel. The authorities responded immediately. Before the sun had fully risen, orders were given to secure the town. Militia units moved from street to street. Doors were knocked on. Enslaved men were pulled from sleeping quarters and questioned harshly. Suspicion spreads faster than truth. It did not matter who had been present at the fire and who had not. What mattered was restoring control. The colony could not allow uncertainty to linger. If rebellion was possible once, it might be possible again. And so, the arrests began. Those arrested were brought before colonial officials quickly, but justice was not the goal. Assurance was. The court wanted to send a message that defiance would be crushed completely. Trials were swift and harsh. Enslaved Africans accused of involvement were not granted the protections that white colonists enjoyed. Testimony could be forced. Confessions could be extracted under pressure. Fear hung in the courtroom, as thick as it had in the square the night before. The judges already believed a conspiracy existed beyond what had been witnessed. They feared hidden leaders. They feared secret meetings. They feared the possibility that enslaved Africans across the colony might share plans. In that climate of panic, logic became secondary to intimidation. The accused were pressed to name others. Under torture and threat of death, some gave names. Each new name led to another arrest. The prison cells filled. Some of the accused denied everything. Others confessed under pain. The legal process moved with alarming speed. The colony was determined not only to punish the guilty, but to frighten the innocent into submission. And so verdicts were handed down quickly. The sentences were brutal by design. Several of the convicted were condemned to be burned alive, a punishment chosen not only to kill, but to terrify anyone who watched. Others were sentenced to hang in public view. Some were broken on the wheel, a method that shattered bone before life ended. The executions took place before large crowds. Enslaved Africans were forced to witness the suffering. White colonists gathered in numbers to reassure themselves that order was returning. The spectacle was deliberate. Colonial leaders believed that fear must be visible. Flames rose once more. This time, not from a building, but from the bodies of men who had dared to resist. The message was unmistakable. Rebellion would not only fail, it would end in agony. Yet beneath that spectacle lay another truth. The colony would not have responded with such ferocity if it had not been deeply shaken. Power does not lash out so violently when it feels secure. The intensity of the punishment revealed the depth of the fear. For every colonist who felt safer watching the executions, another likely felt unsettled by the knowledge that enslaved Africans had shown coordination and courage. In the weeks that followed, new laws were drafted and passed. Restrictions tightened even further. Enslaved Africans were forbidden from gathering in groups larger than a small number. They were not permitted to carry firearms or sharp tools without supervision. Nighttime curfews were enforced with greater vigilance. Manumission became more complicated. The colony sought to close every possible opening through which rebellion might grow. Patrols increased. Informants were encouraged. Suspicion lingered long after the executions ended. But history teaches that fear cannot permanently erase memory. The Revolt of 1712 became a warning told again and again in colonial households. Parents spoke of it to children. Officials referenced it when proposing stricter laws. It entered the collective memory of New York as proof that enslaved Africans were capable of organized resistance. And though the revolt had been crushed, it left a mark deeper than any brand pressed into flesh. It showed that beneath enforced obedience, determination could survive. It showed that even in a northern colony, far from southern plantations, slavery was not peaceful submission, but a system always at risk of being challenged. And as we move deeper into this story, we will examine how that night of fire continued to shape New York's racial laws, how it influenced later fears of conspiracy, and how the voices of those who resisted, though largely erased from official records, still echo through history as evidence of courage in the face of overwhelming power. The Revolt of 1712 did not end when the last execution was carried out and the final body lowered from the gallows, because events like that do not disappear with the smoke. They settle into memory and begin shaping the future in quiet but powerful ways. In the months that followed, New York did not look different at first glance. Ships still entered the harbor. Traders still counted barrels and coins. Church bells still rang on Sunday mornings. Yet something fundamental had shifted inside the minds of both the enslaved and the enslavers. Before that April night, many white colonists believed that harsh discipline was enough to keep order permanently. They believed the chains were secure. After the fire and ambush, that belief fractured. The revolt had shown that enslaved Africans could organize with patience, could coordinate their actions, and could strike in a way that shocked the colony. Even though the revolt involved a limited number of participants, its psychological effect was enormous. The fear of organized resistance became a constant presence. Parents spoke of it in hushed tones. Officials referenced it when arguing for stricter enforcement. The revolt entered the political language of the colony as a warning, as proof that slavery was not a stable institution resting on obedience alone, but on tension waiting to ignite. The colonial government responded not only with executions, but with systematic tightening of control. New legislation was passed to ensure that no similar event could occur again. Enslaved Africans were forbidden from gathering in groups beyond a very small number without supervision. Nighttime curfews were enforced with greater severity. Movement outside designated areas required permission. The possession of firearms or sharp tools without explicit approval became grounds for harsh punishment. The colony also restricted manumission, making it more difficult for enslaved individuals to gain freedom legally. Officials believed that limiting the growth of the free black population would reduce opportunities for organization. Patrol systems expanded. White citizens were encouraged to report any behavior that seemed suspicious. Suspicion became woven into daily life. A simple conversation between two enslaved workers could now attract unwanted attention. A shared meal after sunset might be interpreted as conspiracy. The revolt had not only exposed vulnerability, it had transformed ordinary activities into potential threats in the eyes of colonial authority. Yet, while the white population responded with fear-driven control, the enslaved community responded with memory. Though public executions were meant to intimidate, they also confirmed a truth that could not be erased. Resistance was possible. It had happened. The colony had been shaken. That knowledge mattered deeply. Even in chains, people measure possibility carefully. The revolt showed that even in a northern colony, where slavery operated within homes and urban workshops, rather than vast plantations, coordination could occur. It demonstrated that resentment could become action. Enslaved Africans in New York came from diverse backgrounds across West and Central Africa. They carried languages, cultural traditions, and memories of autonomy. Though divided by forced relocation and by colonial restrictions, they found ways to communicate. The revolt suggests that networks of trust existed beneath surveillance. Shared hardship created bonds, and while fear of punishment was real and powerful, the longing for dignity remained equally real. The revolt did not free them, but it confirmed that they were not powerless in spirit. As years passed, The memory of 1712 continued to influence policy and perception. Nearly 3 decades later, during the Panic of 1741, rumors of another supposed slave conspiracy swept through New York. That later crisis led to more trials and executions, many of which historians now believe were fueled by exaggerated fear rather than solid evidence. Yet the foundation of that panic rested partly on the memory of the earlier revolt. Officials remembered that rebellion had once been real. That memory made them quick to believe new accusations. Thus, the events of 1712 echoed far beyond their immediate aftermath. They shaped legal frameworks. They shaped racial attitudes. They shaped the psychology of control in the colony. Today, historians recognize the revolt as one of the earliest documented slave uprisings in the Northern American colonies. It challenges the assumption that resistance was limited to the Southern plantation system. It reminds us that slavery, whether in fields or cities, was maintained by force and contested by those forced to endure it. The men who set the fire and waited in the shadows are remembered only faintly through colonial records written by those who condemned them. Their names are often incomplete. Their voices were not preserved in letters or journals, but their act remains recorded as a moment when the oppressed struck back against their condition. It was a brief moment, crushed swiftly, but powerful enough to alter the course of colonial fear and law. And as we continue this story, we will explore not only the political impact of the revolt, but the human cost carried by families, communities, and generations who lived under the shadow of that April night, proving that even when revolts fail to bring immediate freedom, they reshape history in ways that endure long after the flames have faded. After the revolt of 1712 and the brutal wave of executions that followed, life in New York continued outwardly, with trade, church gatherings, and colonial business. Yet beneath that surface, a deep tension remained that would shape the colony for decades. The white population told the story of that April night again and again, often exaggerating its scale in order to justify harsher laws. In taverns and at dinner tables, the revolt was described as a terrifying conspiracy, sometimes framed as proof that enslaved Africans were inherently dangerous. Fear became a tool. Leaders used it to defend stricter policies. Ministers used it in sermons as a warning about disorder. Merchants used it to argue for more patrols near docks and warehouses. The revolt became more than a historical event. It became a symbol employed whenever authority felt threatened. And symbols, once formed, are powerful. They influence decisions long after facts fade. At the same time, enslaved Africans carried their own version of memory. Though many participants had been executed, their courage was not forgotten among those who labored quietly in kitchens, fields, and workshops. The revolt demonstrated that unity could disrupt power, even briefly. It showed that the system was not invincible. Yet the price had been severe. Families were left grieving. Mothers lost sons. Wives lost husbands. The public executions were meant to frighten, and they did. Fear is real when the consequences of action are death, by hanging or fire. But fear and determination can exist together. The colony may have believed it crushed rebellion entirely, yet it could not crush thought. It could not erase the awareness that enslaved Africans had acted with purpose. That awareness lived quietly beneath daily routines. Over time, the revolt influenced the structure of slavery in New York in subtle but lasting ways. Masters increased supervision within households. Urban slavery in New York had allowed some enslaved individuals to move between homes and workshops with limited independence compared to plantation systems. After 1712, that limited independence narrowed. More attention was paid to who visited whom. Curfews were enforced earlier in the evening. Punishments for minor infractions became more severe. Even free black residents felt the tightening pressure. Though legally free, they were often viewed with suspicion as potential organizers or communicators. The colony blurred distinctions between enslaved and free black populations when it came to fear. The revolt thus contributed to a more rigid racial order in Northern society, strengthening barriers that would endure well into the 18th century. Historians examining colonial New York now understand that the Revolt of 1712 was not simply an isolated outburst of violence. It was part of a broader Atlantic world of resistance. During this period, enslaved Africans in the Caribbean and in southern colonies also rebelled against bondage. News traveled along trade routes. Stories moved with sailors and merchants. Though colonial authorities attempted to isolate enslaved communities from such information, ideas could not be contained completely. The revolt in New York reflected a pattern seen across slave societies. Wherever forced labor and harsh discipline existed, resistance eventually surfaced. It might take the form of escape. It might take the form of sabotage. Or, as in 1712, it might take the form of organized attack. The revolt stands today as evidence that northern colonies were deeply connected to the larger system of Atlantic slavery and its tensions. It challenges the myth that slavery in the North was mild or passive. Instead, it reveals a system sustained by fear and contested by courage. As we continue forward, we will look at how later generations remembered or attempted to forget the revolt, and how its legacy continues to shape our understanding of early American history. The 1712 revolt did not end in the courtroom, nor did it disappear when the ashes cooled, because events like that settle deep into the foundation of a society and quietly reshape it for generations. In the years that followed, New York grew steadily as a port city, its docks busy with ships carrying sugar, rum, timber, and enslaved human beings across the Atlantic world. Wealth increased for merchants and landowners. Streets expanded. Buildings rose taller. Yet beneath that growth lay an unspoken anxiety. The revolt had proven that control was not absolute. It had revealed that enslaved Africans in the northern colonies were not merely passive laborers, but individuals capable of coordinated resistance. This realization changed how white colonists saw their own security. They no longer believed that harsh discipline alone could guarantee obedience. Instead, they built an even more watchful society, one where surveillance became routine and suspicion became habit. Every unusual gathering was questioned. Every whisper between workers could be interpreted as conspiracy. The revolt became a lesson taught quietly within white households. Children heard stories of the night when fire drew men into a trap. That story was repeated not to honor the courage of the enslaved, but to warn against complacency. The colony used the memory as justification for expanding control. Laws passed after 1712 were not temporary. They became part of the legal structure of New York for decades. Restrictions on movement, curfews, and prohibitions on weapons were enforced with greater intensity. Patrols walked the streets after dark. Informants were encouraged. Fear transformed into policy. Yet while colonial leaders used memory as a tool of control, the enslaved population carried memory differently. For them, the revolt represented proof that action was possible. Though the cost had been devastating, the moment itself mattered. It showed that unity could disrupt authority, even if only briefly. That knowledge lived quietly in conversations that took place beyond the ears of overseers. It lived in songs whose meanings were layered and subtle. It lived in glances exchanged across crowded kitchens and docks. Enslaved Africans in New York came from diverse regions, speaking different languages and carrying different cultural traditions. Yet shared suffering created shared understanding. The revolt revealed that communication networks existed beneath surveillance. Trust had been built in hidden ways. Even after the executions, the awareness of possibility could not be erased. At the same time, fear of punishment weighed heavily. Public burnings and hangings were intended to discourage further rebellion, and they did create caution. The brutality of the response reminded everyone of the risk involved in open defiance. Thus, two forces existed side by side within the enslaved community. Caution, shaped by terror, and hope shaped by memory. The colony could punish bodies, but it could not fully police thought. As decades passed, the legacy of 1712 resurfaced in new forms of panic. In 1741, nearly 30 years later, New York was gripped by another wave of fear when a series of fires broke out across the city. Rumors spread that enslaved Africans and poor white laborers were plotting another uprising. Trials followed. Dozens were arrested. Many were executed or transported out of the colony. Historians today debate whether the 1741 conspiracy was real or largely imagined, fueled by anxiety rather than organized resistance. But one fact is clear. The memory of 1712 influenced how authorities responded. Because a revolt had occurred once before, officials were quicker to believe that another could be underway. The earlier uprising had become a permanent reference point in colonial thinking. It shaped interpretation of events decades later. It intensified racial suspicion and justified extreme measures. The echo of 1712 thus reached far beyond its immediate aftermath. It influenced legal practices, court procedures, and the general atmosphere of mistrust between racial groups in New York. The revolt also holds a powerful place in the broader history of slavery in America. For many years, public narratives about slavery in the North minimized its severity. Textbooks often focused on plantation life in the South, while portraying Northern slavery as smaller in scale and less violent. Yet the events of 1712 challenge that simplified view. They reveal that Northern colonies relied deeply on enslaved labor and enforced control through harsh punishment. They show that resistance was not limited by geography. Whether in rural plantations or urban centers, enslaved Africans resisted when opportunity appeared. The revolt stands as one of the earliest documented organized slave uprisings in what would later become the United States. Its existence proves that the struggle for dignity and freedom was present in the North from the earliest colonial years. It reminds us that slavery was not merely an economic system, but a structure maintained through force, fear, and surveillance. In examining this history today, scholars emphasize the importance of recovering the voices of those who resisted. Unfortunately, most of what we know about the 1712 revolt comes from colonial court records, written by officials who condemned the participants. The names of some attackers were recorded, but their words were filtered through hostile authorities. Their motivations were described from the perspective of those in power. As a result, the inner thoughts of the enslaved men who set the fire and waited in the shadows remain largely unknown. We can only infer their intentions from context. We know they lived under harsh conditions. We know they faced restricted movement and severe punishment. We know they chose a plan that relied on strategy and surprise. That alone suggests determination and courage. Their act was not random chaos. It was organized resistance shaped by experience. The human cost of the revolt was immense. Families were torn apart. The executions were not only punishment for individuals, but trauma for entire communities. Enslaved Africans forced to watch their companions die carried that memory forward. Grief mixed with fear. Yet even in grief, the knowledge of resistance endured. That endurance speaks to a deeper truth about oppressed communities throughout history. Systems of domination attempt to control bodies and silence voices, but the desire for dignity persists. It may be expressed quietly for years. It may wait for an opportunity. It may surface unexpectedly, but it remains. The 1712 revolt represents one such moment when suppressed anger transformed into action. Today, historians and educators revisit this event not to glorify violence, but to understand complexity. The revolt forces us to confront uncomfortable realities about early American history. It shows that slavery in the North was real, harsh, and contested. It reveals that colonial authorities responded to fear with brutality. It highlights how law can be shaped by panic, and it honors, in measured reflection, the courage of those who risked everything to challenge their condition. Though their revolt did not succeed in bringing freedom, it succeeded in exposing the fragility of a system built on forced obedience. It succeeded in planting a memory that would influence policy for decades. And it succeeded in leaving behind a record that modern generations can study as evidence of early resistance. As we move toward the conclusion of this story, we carry with us the image of that April night in 1712, flames rising into the dark sky, colonists rushing toward danger unaware of the trap, enslaved men emerging from shadows with resolve in their hearts. We carry the image of the courtroom where verdicts were delivered swiftly and without mercy. We carry the image of public executions meant to erase rebellion. And we carry the knowledge that even under the heaviest oppression, the human desire for autonomy can ignite unexpectedly. The revolt of 1712 did not topple a colony, but it shook one profoundly. It reminds us that history is shaped not only by governors and merchants, but by those whose names appear briefly in court records before being nearly erased. Their act remains part of the foundation of American history. It challenges us to remember that the struggle for freedom began long before the nation itself was formed. And as we prepare to close this journey in the next chapter, we reflect on how fire, though extinguished quickly, can leave marks that endure far longer than the flames themselves. The revolt of 1712 did not only change laws and punish bodies, it changed the psychology of the colony itself. After the executions ended and the square returned to silence, something invisible remained hanging in the air. It was not smoke. It was not ash. It was awareness. White colonists could no longer pretend that slavery in New York was calm and controlled. They had seen men they believed powerless to organize in secrecy. They had seen calculated timing. They had seen coordination. That realization forced them to confront a deeper truth. Enslaved Africans were thinking constantly. They were observing weaknesses. They were communicating in ways that colonists did not fully understand. The revolt may have been crushed quickly, but the idea behind it could not be erased. And ideas, once proven possible, are difficult to suppress completely. In taverns along the harbor, merchants spoke cautiously about security. In council meetings, officials debated whether they had underestimated the risk of uprising in a northern colony. New York had long believed itself safer than the Sugar Islands of the Caribbean, where large-scale revolts were more common. But 1712 shattered that confidence. The geography of New York made the revolt even more alarming to authorities. Unlike vast southern plantations, where enslaved people were spread across large fields. New York was compact. Homes, docks, warehouses, and streets were tightly clustered. Enslaved Africans worked in households directly beside white families. They moved through the city, delivering goods, tending fires, repairing equipment, cooking meals. This proximity created constant contact between enslaved and enslaved. It also created opportunity. The men who planned the revolt understood this. They knew colonists would rush toward fire instinctively. They knew chaos would create confusion. Their plan reflected careful thought about how the city functioned. That intelligence frightened officials deeply. If enslaved men understood the rhythms of colonial life so well, what other vulnerabilities existed? What other weaknesses might be studied in silence? In response, surveillance expanded in subtle and direct ways. White citizens were encouraged to observe behavior more closely. Masters were warned not to grant too much independence to servants. Some enslaved Africans who had previously been allowed limited movement between households found their privileges reduced. Apprenticeships were monitored more strictly. Informal gatherings were viewed as suspicious. Even religious meetings were watched carefully, as authorities feared that spiritual gatherings might conceal political discussion. The colony tightened its grip, not only through law, but through atmosphere. Trust weakened further. Conversations grew guarded. Yet this increased pressure created another tension. The more the colony sought to monitor every interaction, the more it revealed its own fear. And fear and authority can inspire both caution and resentment among those subjected to it. The economic impact of the revolt also deserves attention. New York's prosperity relied on enslaved labor across multiple industries. Dock workers unloaded cargo. Craftsmen built structures. Domestic servants maintained households. Fear of uprising created hesitation in trade relationships. Some merchants worried about shipping patterns and labor stability. Though the revolt did not cripple the economy, it introduced uncertainty. Investors and officials alike understood that instability threatened profit. Thus, control was not only about punishment, it was about protecting economic interests. Slavery was not an abstract moral issue to the colony, it was a financial foundation. The revolt reminded the elite that that foundation rested on unwilling labor. And unwilling labor always carries the risk of resistance. For the enslaved community, daily life resumed outwardly. Work continued at dawn. Tools were lifted. Meals were prepared. Orders were obeyed. Yet beneath that obedience lingered memory. The revolt had shown that unity, even among a small number, could produce shock powerful enough to disrupt authority. That awareness did not disappear simply because punishment was severe. Instead, it settled into a long-term strategy. Resistance would not always look like an open attack. It could take quieter forms. It could involve slowing work. It could involve breaking tools. It could involve preserving cultural traditions despite restrictions. The revolt may have been a dramatic moment, but it existed within a larger continuum of resistance that included countless small acts, rarely recorded in official documents. Colonial leaders also faced an uncomfortable dilemma. They needed enslaved labor to maintain growth, but the more enslaved Africans they brought into the colony, the greater the numerical imbalance became. Fear of being outnumbered intensified. Demographic calculations began to influence policy decisions. Laws restricting importation were debated carefully. The colony wanted labor, but it also wanted control. This tension created a fragile balance. 1712 had proven that even a small, coordinated group could cause deadly consequences. What if future resistance involved greater numbers? What if communication spread more widely? These questions haunted officials. The revolt also entered the oral tradition of both communities. Among white colonists, it became a cautionary tale. Among enslaved Africans, it became proof of courage. Though official records framed participants as criminals,
I can't see the smoke!
within the enslaved community, they may have been remembered differently.
Everywhere! Keep running!
Stories passed quietly from one generation to another can shape identity.
Fires are everywhere! Keep running!
Even when names fade, actions
to the alley.
remain. The fact that enslaved men dared to strike at all became a symbol of human refusal to accept complete submission. That symbolism would resonate subtly in later decades, influencing how enslaved people in New York viewed their own capacity for action. As years progressed, the Revolt of 1712 stood as warning and reminder simultaneously. For the colony, it justified surveillance and harsh codes. For the enslaved, it affirmed that rebellion was possible, even if costly. That dual legacy ensured that the event would not vanish quietly. Instead, it would become one of the foundational chapters in the long history of resistance in Northern America. And as we move toward the next chapter, we will examine how memory of 1712 shaped generational attitudes, influenced legal reform, and laid psychological groundwork for the later crisis of 1741, where fear, once again, gripped New York, and the shadow of the earlier revolt returned with powerful force. By the time a new generation came of age in New York, the Revolt of 1712 had already moved from recent memory into inherited warning. Children who were not yet born when the flames rose near Broadway grew up hearing about the night enslaved Africans struck back. For white families, the story was told as proof that vigilance must never relax. For black families living in bondage, the story carried a different tone. It was spoken carefully, quietly, and often without full detail, yet its meaning was clear. There had been a moment when fear shifted direction. There had been a night when enslaved men forced the colony to tremble. The executions that followed were meant to erase pride and plant terror. But memory does not follow instructions. It settles into culture. It becomes part of identity. And in this way, 1712 became more than an event. It became a legacy. As the colony expanded through the early and middle 18th century, slavery in New York remained central to economic life. Enslaved Africans worked in agriculture outside the city, but within New York itself, many labored in urban trades. They were blacksmiths, carpenters, dockhands, cooks, and domestic servants. Their labor touched every part of colonial daily life, yet their presence continued to generate unease among white colonists who remembered the revolt. Laws did not soften with time. In many cases, they hardened. Masters were reminded to maintain discipline firmly. Authorities discouraged any sign of independence. Even minor acts of defiance were punished quickly to prevent escalation. The colony's leadership understood something fundamental. Rebellion does not emerge from comfort. It grows from accumulated resentment. And while they could not remove resentment entirely, they attempted to manage it through constant oversight. The revolt also shaped the psychological landscape of power in New York. White colonists no longer believed themselves immune from organized resistance. They had seen proof that even a small group could coordinate under cover of darkness. This realization created a pattern of preemptive suspicion. When unexplained events occurred, especially fires, authorities reacted quickly and sometimes excessively. That pattern would become painfully clear in 1741, when a series of fires again struck New York, and rumors of conspiracy spread rapidly. In that later crisis, dozens were arrested, tried, and executed. Many historians now believe that fear, rather than solid evidence, drove much of the panic. But the memory of 1712 played a silent role. Officials remembered that revolt had once been real. That memory fueled urgency and severity in response. Thus, the shadow of 1712 extended far beyond its immediate year. It shaped how authorities interpreted later events. Within the enslaved community, strategies of resistance evolved. Open revolt carried immense risk, as demonstrated by the brutal punishments of 1712. Therefore, resistance often took subtler forms. Some slowed their work intentionally. Some damaged tools discreetly. Some preserved African traditions and secret gatherings that reinforced identity and unity. Cultural memory became a powerful tool. Songs carried coded meaning. Stories passed down not only entertained but preserved values of courage and endurance. These acts rarely appeared in colonial records because they were difficult to detect or prove. Yet they mattered deeply. They allowed enslaved Africans to maintain a sense of self in a system designed to strip identity away. The revolt served as a reminder that collective action was possible, even if immediate repetition seemed impossible under heightened surveillance. As decades advanced toward the mid-18th century, the Atlantic world itself was shifting. Ideas about liberty and rights began circulating more widely among European colonists. Tensions between colonies and the British Crown would eventually lead to the American Revolution later in the century. Yet even as white colonists spoke of freedom from imperial control, many continued to rely on enslaved labor. This contradiction would grow sharper over time. The memory of 1712 revealed an uncomfortable truth. Those denied liberty were willing to fight for it. The revolt had demonstrated that enslaved Africans were not passive observers of colonial change. They were participants in the larger struggle over power, even if their participation was suppressed violently. As we move into the next chapter, we will examine how the broader currents of Atlantic politics and emerging revolutionary ideas intersected with the legacy of 1712, and how the seeds planted in that early revolt would continue to influence the path of New York as it moved toward a new and uncertain future. As the 18th century moved forward and the Atlantic world shifted toward greater political unrest, the memory of 1712 remained embedded within the structure of New York's society, like a scar that never fully healed. Trade continued to expand. The port grew busier. New York became more important within the British Empire. Wealth increased for merchants and landowners, yet prosperity rested on the labor of enslaved Africans whose status had not changed, despite growing conversations among white colonists about rights and liberty. By the time tensions with Britain intensified in the decades leading toward revolution, colonial leaders spoke passionately about taxation without representation and the injustice of distant authority. They demanded recognition of their freedoms as English subjects, but within their own city, thousands of men and women remained in chains. The revolt of 1712 stood quietly as a reminder of this contradiction. If colonists believed liberty was a natural right, what did that mean for those they enslaved? Enslaved Africans in New York watched these developments carefully. News traveled through docks and markets. Sailors carried stories from other colonies and from overseas. Rumors of rebellion in distant places circulated despite attempts to restrict information. The revolt of 1712 had already shown that enslaved people in New York could organize and act under extreme restriction. Now, new language about rights and independence entered colonial conversation. Though enslaved Africans were excluded from political debate, they were not unaware of it. The gap between words and reality became increasingly visible. When white colonists declared that tyranny should be resisted, enslaved people could not help but measure those words against their own condition. The earlier revolt had been sparked by immediate frustration and opportunity. The later decades added ideological tension to that frustration. During the American Revolution, which erupted later in the 18th century, slavery in New York did not disappear. In fact, both British and American forces sought to use enslaved people for military advantage. The British, at times, promised freedom to enslaved Africans, who joined their side. This created new pathways of resistance. Some enslaved individuals fled to British lines, seeking liberation. Others remained with American masters, who themselves claimed to fight for liberty while maintaining bondage. Though these events occurred decades after 1712, they were shaped by the same underlying tension. The revolt had already proven that enslaved Africans in New York were willing to risk everything for a chance at freedom. When wartime instability created opportunity, that memory likely influenced decision-making among those still in chains. By the end of the 18th century, gradual emancipation laws began to take shape in New York. In 1799, the state passed legislation that would eventually lead to the end of slavery, though full abolition would not occur until the early 19th century. The path toward emancipation was slow and incomplete, yet it marked a significant transformation. When historians trace the long arc from 1712 to eventual abolition, they see continuity. The revolt was not an isolated spark, but an early chapter in extended struggle. It exposed the fragility of slavery in the northern colony. It forced lawmakers to recognize that repression alone could not guarantee stability forever. It demonstrated that enslaved Africans were active agents within history, not silent background figures. The legacy of 1712 therefore stretches beyond the immediate violence of that April night. It shaped laws. It shaped fear. It shaped future panic during 1741. It shaped how New York approached slavery during the Revolution. And it shaped the slow, complicated journey toward emancipation. The men who set the fire and waited in the shadows did not live to see those later changes. Their lives ended brutally in public spectacle, but their act became part of foundation upon which later generations built new arguments about freedom. History often moves slowly, through tension, contradiction, and conflict. The Revolt of 1712 stands as one of the earliest reminders that slavery in America would never be unchallenged. And as we approach the final chapters of this story, we will explore how modern historians interpret this revolt today, and why its memory continues to matter in conversations about race, resistance, and the true complexity of early American history. In modern times, the Revolt of 1712 has taken on renewed significance as historians revisit the foundations of American history and question long-held assumptions about slavery in the northern colonies. For many years, public memory focused more heavily on plantation rebellions in the South, leaving northern uprisings in relative obscurity. Textbooks often emphasized economic growth, trade expansion, and political development in colonial New York, while mentioning slavery only briefly. Yet archival research and scholarly study have revealed how deeply slavery shaped the city from its earliest days. The Revolt of 1712 stands as powerful evidence that northern slavery was not mild, temporary, or peaceful. It was enforced through strict codes, public punishment, and constant surveillance, and it was resisted. That resistance, though crushed violently, challenges simplified narratives about early American society. Archaeologists and historians have uncovered burial grounds, legal records, and economic documents that illuminate the daily lives of enslaved Africans in New York. These discoveries help reconstruct the world in which the revolt occurred. They show communities that maintained cultural traditions despite oppression, They reveal labor patterns that placed enslaved workers in close contact with urban infrastructure. They highlight the diversity of African origins among the enslaved population. All of this context deepens understanding of why resistance emerged. The revolt was not a random explosion of violence. It was a product of conditions that combined harsh discipline, restricted movement, and shared memory of freedom. By studying these conditions carefully, modern scholars gain insight into the psychology of colonial power and the resilience of enslaved communities. Public history projects in New York have also begun acknowledging the revolt more openly. Museums, historical markers, and educational programs now reference 1712 as part of the city's story. This recognition matters because it expands collective memory. It reminds residents and visitors alike that the foundations of New York were built not only by merchants and governors, but by enslaved laborers whose lives were constrained by force. It encourages honest conversation about how prosperity and oppression existed side by side. When students learn about the revolt today, they are confronted with complex questions. How does a society reconcile ideals of liberty with practices of bondage? How do fear and power interact within law? How do oppressed people preserve identity under extreme pressure? The revolt provides a lens through which these questions can be explored. Yet even as scholarship grows, the voices of the men who carried out the revolt remain largely silent in the record. We know fragments of names. We know the method of their plan. We know the severity of their punishment, but we do not know their full stories. We do not know the conversations that led to their decision. We do not know the precise hopes they held when they lit the fire. That absence reminds us that history often preserves the perspective of authority more clearly than that of resistance. Part of the responsibility of modern study is to read between lines, to understand context, and to acknowledge humanity behind limited documentation. The Revolt of 1712 stands not only as an event of violence, but as testament to the enduring human desire for dignity. As we move into the final chapter, we will bring together the threads of memory, fear, resistance, and legacy to understand why that April night still echoes through the history of New York and through the broader story of America itself. As we bring this story to a wrap, we return again to the narrow streets of colonial New York in the year 1712, to the crackling sound of fire against dry wood, to the sudden rush of men running with buckets, to the sharp shock of gunfire in the darkness, and to the realization that a group of enslaved Africans had dared to challenge a system that had reduced them to property. That single night did not overthrow the colony, yet it shattered something deeper than buildings. It shattered certainty. Before that moment, many white colonists believed their control was firm, their laws sufficient, their punishments effective enough to prevent organized resistance. After that moment, they knew something different. They knew that beneath silence there could be planning. They knew that beneath forced obedience there could be strategy. They knew that those they enslaved were not passive bodies, but thinking human beings capable of coordination and courage. The revolt was brief, and the retaliation was swift and brutal, but its psychological impact stretched far beyond the smoke that drifted over the harbor. The executions that followed were meant to erase the possibility of rebellion. Burning alive, hanging, and breaking on the wheel were not simply punishments. They were warnings carved into public memory. Yet history shows again and again that fear cannot permanently extinguish the desire for dignity. The men who set that fire may not have survived to see change, but their action became part of the long and complex story of resistance in America. The colony responded by tightening laws, restricting gatherings, limiting movement, and deepening surveillance. Patrols increased. Suspicion grew. Trust weakened. But even as the system hardened, it revealed its own vulnerability. A system confident in its strength does not react with such intensity. The Revolt of 1712 proved that slavery in the North was not a quiet or mild institution. It was maintained by force, fear, and legal control, and it was contested by those forced to endure it. As decades passed, the memory of that night resurfaced again during the Panic of 1741, when fires once more ignited fear and led to further trials and executions. Whether those later conspiracies were real or exaggerated, the earlier revolt shaped how authorities interpreted events. Fear from the past influenced action in the present. In that way, 1712 continued to shape New York long after the last participant was buried. It influenced law. It influenced perception. It influenced racial hierarchy. And it influenced how colonists balanced their dependence on enslaved labor with their fear of those they enslaved. When the American Revolution later introduced language of liberty and rights into colonial conversation, enslaved Africans in New York could not help but measure those words against their own condition. The contradiction between declared freedom and practiced bondage became sharper. Gradual emancipation laws passed in 1799 and later years did not erase centuries of suffering, but they marked movement in direction that resistance had long demanded. The revolt did not cause emancipation directly, yet it formed part of the moral and psychological landscape that made slavery increasingly difficult to defend without question. Modern historians now recognize 1712 as one of the earliest organized slave uprisings in Northern America. It challenges myths that slavery in the North was minor or peaceful. It reveals that enslaved Africans resisted wherever slavery existed. It reminds us that American history is not only story of founders and governors, but also of those whose names appear briefly in court records before fading. The men who set that fire left behind limited documentation, yet their act speaks clearly across centuries. It tells us that the desire for freedom does not vanish under restriction. It tells us that oppression can generate resistance, even in places considered stable. It tells us that systems built on forced labor carry within them seeds of instability. Today, when we walk through modern New York, surrounded by steel towers and endless movement, it is difficult to imagine that small colonial settlement where fear once ruled narrow streets. Yet beneath the concrete lies ground shaped by bondage and by resistance. The Revolt of 1712 reminds us to look honestly at that foundation. It calls us to acknowledge that prosperity in early America was intertwined with slavery. It calls us to recognize the courage of those who dared to challenge injustice despite overwhelming odds. And it calls us to reflect on how fear and control continue to influence societies long after specific events fade from immediate memory. The story of 1712 is not comfortable. It contains violence, punishment, and suffering. But it also contains evidence of human will. It reveals that even in the harshest systems, people seek dignity. It demonstrates that history is shaped not only by those